Good afternoon, everybody. How's everybody doing today? In the immortal words of some of the greatest artists of our time, it is the first of the month. So happy birthday, happy anniversary, happy whatever makes this day special for you. We're excited. It's a special day for us here at the United Way because this is kicking off season 2 of our Justice series. Today's Justice Series episode is entitled United for an Anti-Racist Future. My name is Nick Allen. I am the Chief Program Officer at the United Way of the Greater Triangle. And I am joined today by a very special guest. Our guest today is originally from Goldston, North Carolina. In 2018, she earned her doctorate at UNC Chapel Hill in policy, leadership, and school improvement program. Go Tar Heels. Her research interests are critical race theory, whiteness studies, white children's racial identity construction, and anti-racism. Prior to entering her doctoral program, Dr. Ronda Taylor Bullock taught English for almost 10 years at Hillside High School in Durham, North Carolina, where she now resides. Ronda is also the co-founder and executive director of We Are. She is the wife of Dr. Daniel Kelvin Bullock and mother of son Zion and daughter Zaire. Welcome, Ronda. How are you doing this morning?
Thank you so much, Nick. Thank you so much. I'm doing well. I'm hanging in there, all things considered, and it's a pleasure to be here with you this afternoon.
Ronda, you know, you've dedicated your professional life to anti-racist education. Tell us kind of, you know, how do you approach that? What's an entry point for really teaching people about the important pieces of anti-racism?
Well, I think, thanks for that question, Nick. I think it matters who are we talking about? What age range are we thinking about? And so I'll approach one with adults. When entering these conversations, particularly as you know, anti-racist activist, one who roots my work in through education, I believe that we should start with the individual, right? And so through our workshops and trainings, we start with like implicit bias, because we want people to take this, you know, large, big idea about racism and zoom in a little bit and locate themselves. Think about their own identities, think about biases, places where they may not be seeing things that are in front of them or even seeing the harm that they're causing, and then zooming out from there. So you can't stay there at the individual because as you know, Nick, racism is not just individual bigotry and bias. Is rooted in systems of harm and history in those systems of harm. And so we just like for people to be able to zoom in, think about their own identity, their blind spots, what they're carrying, and then connect those blind spots to systemic harm and helping people to zoom out. And it's important that we help people to understand the need to zoom in and zoom out, because you can locate how you as an individual are supporting or upholding structural racism. And when it comes to children, we really do similar type work. We start with identity, and we start with names and the importance of names, and learning to pronounce people's names correctly, because that is rooted in historical racism. Renaming Black people, you know, calling them other names, dissociating them from their ancestry and their heritage through renaming, right? And so we come in there and then build up to having conversations about race, racism, and skin color.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, one way we like to think about, you know, the way that racism shows up in our work is that, you know, the evidence, the most impactful and harmful evidence, it shows up at the systems level, right? But the work, and the solutions really start at the individual and personal level, right? And so really appreciate that framing, Ronda. You know, I think generally, the general community, we could all understand what overt racism looks like, right? What it feels like, what it sounds like, what it looks like. But what are some other forms of racism that are maybe not so overt or maybe not so evident to the general community?
Yeah, and that's a place where we're trying to get people to move and understand that it's not just these overt acts between individuals or even between groups of people. Ways that racism shows up that may not be as obvious with people is rooted in, like you said, the data. And so if you look at data across multiple systems, you'll start to see disparities along racial lines. So, for example, because I'm rooted in education, I'll start with education. Um, Black and Brown students are disproportionately suspended in schools. And it's not for fighting and for violent offenses. It's for offenses where ambiguity can come into place, non-compliance with a directive, right? And basically a person's bias about what respect looks like could come into play, and the ways that Black and Brown children are allowed to show up or not allowed to show up. And so Black and Brown children, if you look at the data, they are being for the same offenses that white children commit or do, or misbehaviors, they're being overly punished for those exact same offenses. And so people don't necessarily, they just think, oh, well, Black children cut up more, brown children are more disruptive. But that doesn't hold true when you start to look at the data. We can go to another field. So it's not just education, we can go into medicine, right? In the healthcare, I mean, so many issues in healthcare when you think about Black women, Black mothers, and fetal health care and mortality rate of infants and Black women in given childbirth. And so when they even control for socioeconomic status, Black women are still disproportionately dying in childbirth. Our babies are disproportionately dying after childbirth. And it's not something that you can say, oh, this is an issue with Black women. When you look at the data across the board, it shows up that those disproportionalities are there. And I think that's harder for people sometimes to process and to see. So I've just named two categories, but it's across all of our systems, where if you start to look at it, the implications by race, and by race and gender, we want to bring in intersectionality, we can see these differences occurring.
Absolutely. The sector that I'm closest to professionally is the nonprofit sector, traditional philanthropy, right? And we see some of those same disparities along racial lines. And it forces sometimes the sector, or it allows the sector to make assumptions about, BIPOC-led organizations, right? So if they don't show up, or they don't receive large amounts of funding, or they're not traditionally in the United Way portfolio, there must be something wrong with them, is the assumption, right? That they either lack the leadership capacity or ability, or the programmatic impacts, or many other different excuses that we hear in traditional philanthropy. And what we really aim to do is, when we look for solutions, we have to look at ourselves, right? And what are we doing wrong that is not allowing the full participation of BIPOC leadership, BIPOC-led nonprofits to feel like they're a part of, or could be a part of, the United Way. And I think, as we talk about systemic change, the challenge is for the folks who hold power in those systems to really look in the mirror and put blame on themselves if there are disproportionate outcomes that you can tie to race.
Right. And I think some people get thrown off by this idea of system, and they think they view it as like this inanimate fixed object that is there forever and it is permanent. But going back to what you said, Nick, it takes like people in power taking a step back and looking at, how am I writing policies, implementing policies, supporting policies, voting for policies that are contributing to these disparities. And so we have to start to look at it and humanize the processes that are creating these systems, so that we can see, no, these are not permanent. They can be done. Changes can happen that are within our control.
Absolutely. And the idea that a neutral stance is absolutely supporting the success of racist structures, right? So it has to be an active approach to not only questioning what you can do, but actively working to dismantle those structures, like you just mentioned. I think the question that people ask is, well, what can I do? Right? Like what can I do no matter what position I have or power I hold, or connections or networks that I sit in? How can you help people understand what their next most important step could be if they want to live and contribute to an anti-racist community?
Yeah, and I think, there isn't one right answer, right? Because everybody's in a different place, their circumstances are different, their context is different. And so, and also there isn't a checklist, right? We've had conversations about this before, Nick. People want a checklist. And more often than not, sometimes white people want a checklist. What are the 10 things I need to do? And what I tell folks is there is no checklist, right? There are things. This is a way of life. It's a framework for existing. It's not something that you do 5 things and you're good until the end, right? At the same time, there are legitimate things that folks can do. It's just an infinite list, list of items on that list, right? Or some infinite items on that list. But I will say, some of the first things that people can do to show up differently is research the Black and Brown-led organizations in your community who are on the ground already doing this work. No one is asking anyone to solve racism, right? And if that's your question, if that's your answer, how do we solve this? Then we woefully do not understand what this or it is, right? Well, woeful misunderstanding. And so I think it's important to, wherever you're zooming in from, whatever your context is, Google search, get out in the community and ask, where are these Black and Brown? Where are the people who are most connected to the problem? Where are they doing work? What are those organizations that you can support? Because for years, Black and Brown led organizations have been on the ground doing work, but often, going back to philanthropy, don't receive the funds. And there's data to support that, so that's not my opinion. And find those organizations and ask, how can you show up? Ask if your help is welcomed. Ask if your support is welcomed. Ask, what can you do? Because oftentimes those communities have the answers. They just don't have the resources and access to positions and power to bring forth what they know will work best for them. And so I think that's a really good first step, to do that research, figure out who are those organizations, Black and Brown led, women led, who are already doing the work, and ask. And even in doing that, I think it's important, particularly for those who identify as white, to understand that some of these organizations may say, actually, I don't want your help. That's not a personal response. That is a boundary. That is a safety mechanism, because if you have to zoom out and look at the history of harm that those who identify as white have caused to organizations. And so someone might say, actually, we don't have any space, or there's no way that you can show up here, right? And just be prepared for that. And that's not rooted in bigotry and bias. That's rooted in history and trying to protect oneself from harm, right? And so if you run into that case, research and find another organization, because different people have different needs and are in different places. And so I think that's one of the best steps. Another important step, I think, is to look at, where do you have power? And that's an interesting, a lot of people think, well, I don't have any power. I'm not the boss. I'm not the principal. I'm not the superintendent. I'm not the CEO. I'm not the coordinator. I'm not the director. You have to sit down and think about, but where do you hold power? And I go back specifically into education space. A lot of times we as educators would think that we didn't have power because we weren't the principal, the department chair, and the school board. But we have power to create rules and policies in our classrooms that can connect to the school to prison pipeline, right? Whether or not you write a kid up for using profanity or not can contribute to the school to prison pipeline, right? So regardless of what level you are in your job or in society, find out, where is your power? Where's your locus of control, right? And name that for yourself, and think about, within this space, how can I use my power, my privilege, my knowledge to be disruptive? And I think those are important places to start.
Absolutely. And, I would add to that the importance of a continued cadence of continuing to seek out information that'll help you understand this work better to seek out opportunities where you could operationalize kind of this increased awareness and understanding. I like to use an analogy. I went to the gym one time about 11 years ago, right? And it did not make me in shape, right? And it's been that long since I've been in the gym, right? And so what happens when you lack kind of the consistency is that you don't build the muscle. But we also understand that when you stop going to the gym, that muscle could atrophy, right?
Mhm.
It could absolutely, you can get out of shape real quick. And so, it's not only, taking that next step, but leaning into kind of that hunt for knowledge and understanding and opportunities to contribute to this work that certainly benefits the broader community. Rhonda, let me ask you this. People may assume that anti-racism work falls on the shoulders or is the responsibility of only certain parts of our community. Can you talk about maybe the difference between the roles of white folks in our community and the roles of BIPOC folks in our community in this anti-racism work?
Right. I think it's important, and you'll hear me use this language a lot about zooming in and zooming out. If we zoom out and get a bigger picture, Black, Indigenous, and people of color have been working for years towards liberation, towards freedom, towards revolution, and to disrupt and dismantle white supremacy in our society. Like, we've been working, oftentimes in businesses, in schools, in communities. The labor falls on us, right? And it's as if racism is a problem that Black and brown folks and Indigenous people have to deal with. They have to overcome it. We're doing the work. And it's by and large because many of us cannot sit this one out. Right? This is life and death for us. This is survival for us. We don't have that privilege of sitting this out, many of us, right? And what many activists say is that the work of disrupting and dismantling, white supremacy, white people have to do their part. And they have to recognize that this is not a problem over there. It's actually a problem, that white people who identify as white need to be doing their part to disrupt and to dismantle. For years and even currently, there's people who still deny that racism exists, and that's because they are not the target of discrimination. Right? When you're not the target of discrimination, oftentimes you don't see it. And many times if you and I, if we hadn't experienced something and someone tells us a story, we're like, well, that wasn't my experience there. So sometimes we may not believe it.
Right.
Right. So if that's not your experience, it's harder for you to believe. And by and large, if you're not living among Black and brown folks, it's possible for white people to live in a solely white community and never interact with people from whom they are different. Right. And so that makes our experiences invisible to them. And so it's time. It's past time. And that's not to say some white people over the years have not been involved, but it's not enough. It needs to be more. The conversation need to be happening more. The making room, the giving up one's power and privilege to support those in the community who are most marginalized. There needs to be more of that, right? And stepping out of the way and allowing Black and brown people to lead, to have a seat at the table, to take the table, to not even for white folks to not even, be there to because of the history of harm, right? And I just think that even now in this moment, last summer after the world watched Officer Chauvin murder George Floyd.
Mm-hmm.
You cannot, it's too much. We know too much. We've been known too much, right? But after that moment, you have to decide, what type of world do you want?
Right.
Do you want to live in a racially just, socially just society? And if that's what you desire, then you have to put in the work to make it happen, right? It's just not going to happen naturally. Being a good person is not good enough. Treating everyone equally and kindly is not good enough, right? You have to actively, as you mentioned earlier, you have to actively be anti-racist, because that's the world that we're living in, and that's what it takes for us to move towards a society that many, I can't say all of us, but that many of us want to live in.
Absolutely. Just a quick break here. I want to encourage folks to put questions, submit questions in the question and answer portal. And so, Rhonda, tell us about We Are, right? So, like, we've kind of set this community-wide context and touched on kind of some community level, approaches and talks about systems. Tell us about what We Are stands for, and what We Are's role is in this anti-racism movement.
Yeah, so we're a nonprofit organization located in Durham. We Are stands for Working to Extend Anti-Racist Education. We provide anti-racism training for children, families, and educators. We use a three-pronged approach to dismantle systemic racism in education and beyond by offering summer camps for kids in rising first through fifth grade, professional development for educators, and workshops for parents and families. And so we offer several annual events, such as a Let's Talk Racism conference in March that we do with North Carolina Central University School of Education and Ben and Jerry's Ice Cream. And we bring educators together. That's our target audience, but we have people across the spectrum who come and want to be in that space to learn about how racism is structural and how it's a part of the educational system. We host annual events in the summer, Educator Institute, and curriculum workshops in the fall. And then we do summer camps for kids, anti-racism summer camps for kids. We have 2 in Durham, and we've scaled up to use that business language. We now have 2 in Greensboro as well, but these are week-long camps. And so we have one for kids in rising first through second grade and one for kids in rising third through fifth grade. And we use a literacy-based approach to help children think about race, racism, skin color, activism in very concrete ways. And so whatever book we teach from, we give a copy of it to the kids so that by the end of the week, they have a home library of these books that are helping them wrestle with these very tough topics, but also so that they can continue having these conversations beyond that week there with us. And one of our main goals during that time is to help children to develop healthy racial identities. And we think it's so important that that work begins earlier on in the educational experience versus later or not at all. And we believe, and there's research that shows that explicit intentional education makes a difference in how children view themselves and how they view people from whom they are different.
Mm-hmm. And the poll results are in, fresh off the presses, y'all. Of our audience members, 13, and here's a reminder of the question or the prompt. I understand how I uphold systemic racism is the prompt. 13% of our audience strongly agrees that they understand. 74% agree that they understand, and 13% disagree, that they do not understand how they uphold systemic racism, and 0% strongly disagree. And so, you mentioned this idea of really starting with young folks. I have 2 young children, a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old. I know you have children as well, a little bit older than that. And you talked about the importance of really establishing a strong racial identity in young people. How can maybe parents in the audience, beyond kind of the formalized structure or signing up for a We Are training, what are some small steps they could do in interactions every day to help develop that identity in young people?
Yeah, I think some of the small things is buying books with diverse characters in them, and checking to make sure that those books are culturally authentic. meaning the race and identity of the author aligns with the race and the identity of the characters. And I say that because oftentimes when white people have had access and power and privilege to produce books in ways that people of color have not. And so when they write about other cultures, sometimes stereotypes will creep in there. Not creep. I should not say creep. They write about us in stereotypical ways. Sometimes it's intentional and sometimes it's willful ignorance, but both are harmful, right? And so you have to check to make sure from the language to the to how the story is depicted to the images, you have to check and make sure that those are accurate and not stereotypical. But reading books and or for even babies all the way up to 18-year-olds, reading books hands down that are age appropriate will help you have some entry point conversations. Also across that spectrum, more so with maybe elementary and up, using current events, videos, things that are currently happening, cartoons, as you're watching TV with your children, asking them, do you notice who's missing here? Or what types of people are missing here? Who's present here? Getting children to understand how some people are included or excluded based on their race or identity. Right? And having some of those conversations. I tell parents, sometimes they're like, well, how do I teach my children about white privilege? And I said, well, let's take the Starbucks example that probably about 2 years ago, a year or two ago, where there was 2 Black males in Starbucks who went in to sit down and wait for a meeting to start. Eventually, because they had not ordered yet, the police were called and they were escorted out in handcuffs. Right? And so that's a video that's not as violent as others, right? Because that's still a form of violence, how that, happened. But that's a type of video that you can talk through with a child, particularly those who identify as white, and say, if we've gone into Starbucks, do you think that would have happened to us? Why do you think that happened to them? And to generate a conversation about that. Or if you've been in Starbucks and sat down and did not order, bring up that story. Remember that time when we went and we sat down and nobody bothered us. We were just looking at books and then we left. Using these it's something happens every single day, right? Mm-hmm. And so using these real-time current events to have these conversations. Now, I will say, particularly with younger children or even older, you do have to monitor the visuals, right? My children did not see the George Floyd video. I'm not showing that to them. They were, at the time, I think 6 and 9. Right. I didn't show it to them. And to be honest, I did not watch it myself. I was afraid of where I would go in my spirit that I might not be able to come back. Right.
I couldn't make it through the whole video either.
I couldn't. I read the transcript. It was too much. It was too much for me. So I say that to say you do have to be thoughtful about what you are exposing children to, and you have to know your individual child. Right. And I think that's important. So I just want to reiterate, there isn't one panacea or one way to show up and do this. You have to know your child and where your child is. Sometimes with my child, because we do this all the time, this is how we live. My kids are like, can we just eat? Right. Can we just watch the show, Mom? Can you not ask me questions?
Everything turns into a lesson. Right.
Exactly, because I see it everywhere. So I got to check myself. My kids will, calmly redirect me, but or ask when they need a break, and I recognize it. And I think that's important. Like, we're not asking people to over inundate their children. We're asking you to be on a journey with them. Mm-hmm. Right. And you're not it's a marathon and not a sprint. Right. And those are some of the things that we try to communicate to parents.
Absolutely. The conversations about race, you touched on how current events in the environment that we're in right now, I think has really led to more public conversations about race and how it shows up in this country. It's led to, I think, a willingness to listen and learn in more spaces than has existed previously. And given that, we are in this place and time, where do you see the future of this work headed, right? Like, given that we've changed or so much over, the last few years, just from a public narrative standpoint, what's the future of anti-racism work in your estimation?
I think we're at a pivotal moment right now, if we take in the context of the narratives and the pushback against critical race theory, which I'm a critical race scholar, and we can go either way. We can go toward racial justice, or we can backpedal away from it. And because I want to see, I'm hoping that we, as a community and as a society, will recognize the imperative situation, the sense of urgency that we're in right now, because we're not, I think the election of 2016 and then the subsequent years afterwards also were pivotal for folks to recognize we are not a post-racial society, right? And there are still large groups of people who do not want racial equity and justice, who have power,
right?
Who are gaining momentum. And so I'm not going to put out some fairy tale that anti-racism is going to be here, here, and here. I'm hopeful that, we'll be in the right direction, but I don't want to go too far there without acknowledging the very real threat to our existence, our safety, that if we don't do what we need to do as a society, for those of us who desire to live in peace and in harmony, who believe in liberation of all people, like if we don't do our part to push back, to fight, to march, to write, to sing, to use our art, whatever our gift or talent is, we can go back to some dark places. We have not come far enough yet to where that's so far in our past that it can't happen again.
Appreciate that. Devin, do we have any questions that we could from the audience that we could answer?
Hello, yes, it is the Wizard of Oz here. I've been really enjoying this conversation. We have 2 questions so far in the Q&A, and I'll start with one of them here. This comes from Kate Steele. She says, I am a former teacher and have been recently learning about both critical race theory and culturally responsive teaching. Can you give a short definition of each and how they are related?
So critical race theory is rooted in critical legal studies, and I'm trying to make it as simple as possible. But critical race theory, high level, is let's look at the laws and policies that are part of our country's history and pay attention to how racism is embedded in those laws and policies, and pay attention to how they've impacted our society. That's what critical race theory asks us to do. It asks us to look at laws and policies and how race was embedded in those. For example, with redlining, Jim Crow, segregation, separate but equal. These are laws, right? Slavery, right? These are laws that are embedded in our country. And so critical race theory says, let's look at these laws and policies and draw connections and look at the longitudinal impact. That's what critical race theory asks us to do. And then the other one was culturally relevant teaching. Culturally relevant teaching means getting to know the students who are in your class and using curriculum that aligns with their identities. So historically, we have used some form of culturally relevant teaching, but it was just one culture. It was a white Eurocentric culture, and everybody was given that. And so Black, Brown, women, Indigenous people were made invisible in that curriculum. They were, or if they were included, it was very minor, very little, as if we didn't contribute anything to society. And so we have to name that first. And so what culturally relevant teaching does, it says, let's look at our students, but particularly our Black and Brown and marginalized students and students of color, and the intersectional identities of this, and incorporate who they are, their culture, beliefs, ideas, family structures into the curriculum. Because when we see ourselves in the curriculum, it communicates, it affirms identities. It communicates what we value, what we don't value, what matters, who matters. And so if we're traditionally leaving out Black, Brown, and Indigenous and people of color, we're trained to believe that they don't matter. Right? And I tell people, like, white people have done really well with a Eurocentric curriculum. And that doesn't mean that, now contributions of those who identify as white are excluded. It's just a more inclusive history. It's a more inclusive English background. It's more inclusive of authors outside of the canon, right? It incorporates more people, and it's more reflective of the society that we live in than when we were traditionally having just a Eurocentric type curriculum.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. I also saw a question in the box around, could you shout out some other local leaders doing anti-racism work? And you know, I'd like to take the opportunity to talk a little bit about our approach here at the United Way, and where I can point you to who we feel like we've invested in their anti-racist service delivery in the way that they show up in the triangle. And so as part of our funding opportunity earlier this calendar year, we had a new initiative that we called the Anti-Racism Accelerator opportunity, where for folks who were awarded grants within our traditional Healthy Families and Cradle to Career work, and for organizations who felt like that their service delivery, their approach, their scope was through an anti-racist lens and could demonstrate a history of impact and service delivery in that space, were able to apply for additional dollars, right? And so we were able to award 16 or so organizations in the Triangle that we felt like through an evaluation process that really leaned on who we consider practitioners and local experts in the space to really make decisions and identify those organizations. And so if you head to our website and look at our funded partners, I believe they're identified on there. And if you want to make a connection out to those folks and really understand how anti-racism teaching is operationalized in many different ways in nonprofit work in the Triangle, I encourage you to learn more through that opportunity as well. But Ron, if you also wanted to shout out any other leaders that you work closely with that are really experts in this field, or could lend an opportunity for folks to reach out and learn more.
Yeah, and I mean, you all have done a great job of finding a lot of those organizations. So I know some of these are already out there. And my apologies to any of my activist friends if I leave you out, but I'm thinking about Village of Wisdom, where Dr. William Jackson is the lead. I'm thinking about Empowered Parents and Community, EPIC, where Javonia Lewis is a founder of that organization. I'm thinking about the Racial Equity Institute out of Greensboro, Spirit House, which is in Durham, North Carolina. Those are the top 4 that I have right now, but I know, there are many more. There are so many. And that's the thing, what I want people to know is that Black and Brown folks have been fighting on the ground doing this work for years. These organizations are in your communities. It does take work to talk and network with people to find out who they are, but there's more. There's way more than that, and that's just many of those are just locally here. But find those organizations and invest in them, and then ask, like, how investment is always good, right? But ask if and how there are ways you can support them. Yep,
and for any of those folks that got their feelings hurt because Ronda didn't shout them out, but they come across this video, reach out to us, right? Reach out to the United Way, because the best way that we're going to learn to evolve our structures is through the experiences of folks that we're trying to serve and impact, right? So if what we have does not present as accessible, or you don't see yourself as a partner in the United Way, let us know. Let us know why. So that we can learn and evolve and continue to make sure that we're a United Way for everybody doing this impactful work in the Triangle. There are a couple more questions in the queue, Rhonda, if you don't mind.
No, that's fine.
And I'm gonna read this verbatim to Dr. Bullock. Was there a specific moment or event that happened in your life that made you choose to pursue this field?
There are so many. There are so many. One that I I'm gonna do two real quickly. One, the most recent one was George Zimmerman being acquitted for murdering Trayvon Martin. It did something to me, right? It was another one of those pivotal moments of police brutality that rocked you, that hit you in your core, right? Because Trayvon Martin could have been anyone.
Mhm.
Yeah, right. And it's just, that moment made it clear to me why this work was important to do with children, because for people like George Zimmerman, it's late. It's kind of late to start trying to disrupt those beliefs. I say that in society, oftentimes, if Black folks are positioned as criminals, athletes, or entertainers, and if you're not one of those three, sometimes folks don't have a category for your humanity to just be a Black person trying to make it home, right? And so I started thinking about how do you disrupt those narratives? What does that look like? And I started thinking about this work has to happen with children, because by the time you become an adult, your biases are high and wide. And it's really hard to chip away. Like, adults can verbalize a social justice, anti-racist lens, but then when you look at their behaviors or how they show up on social media and some of their posts, you can start to feel like hopeless. Even though we're not, like, it can feel that way because it takes a lot to undo years of harmful learning, right? The other one that I tell most often, which is rooted in my own personal experiences, race became real to me at 5 in kindergarten. And I had a white classmate who invited everybody at our table to her birthday party except for me. And when I asked, why didn't you invite me? She said, because my dad said Black people are not allowed in our home.
Mhm.
I've been paying attention to race and racism since 5. I've been awakening and on this journey since my first real, school experience. And so those are some pivotal moments that, along with many other, becoming a mom to children, all of these things. It was multiple things that really, led to me wanting to start this organization and to do this work.
Thank you for that, Rhonda. There's a lot of vulnerability and humanizing in that, in those stories that you told, and certainly appreciate you sharing that with us. We have maybe space for 1 or 2 more questions. I'll look at the list. For educators, how can anti-racism education be developmentally appropriate in pre-K through 12 education? Are there major areas of focus for elementary, for middle, and then for high school curriculum?
Oh my goodness, that's a big question. One of the things that I want to say is that I'm so glad they started with pre-K.
Mhm.
So one of the things that we're going to do, and part of what we're using some of our funding for through the United Way 10 to Watch, is to support a pre-K play-based anti-racism curriculum, right? I think that's some work that we're excited to do. We're working in partnership with Farm to Early Care and Education and EPIC. And we're going to be pulling in some others, but it's important to start early and often. And pre-K, there's research and studies that show that racial harm happens in pre-K among children, right? Because the biases form early. And kids as young as 3 and 4 know how to wield whiteness and racism. And it's sad, right? But we want to do this curriculum to help develop and make that age appropriate. And so the question is it would take us a whole nother hour to try to separate that out, but it is possible. I believe that there should be like racial equity and identity development standards in our curriculum, and identity streams throughout. Identity can do with pre-K all the way up to college students, to who we are now as adults, thinking about identity and what contributes to it, and helping children to have these conversations. It is very possible for children to go pre-K 12, pre-K college, and never have a specific conversation about race, racism, or identity, or anti-racism. That is very likely. It has happened. It happens. It's happening now. And so you really just have to, I think for us as adults, we come at it from an adult-centric lens. We automatically go to KKK and lynchings and burning crosses. There's a whole lot of spectrum in between of how racism happens. So you don't have to, I think people automatically go to, oh my gosh, I can't teach kids about this violence, right? But for those who don't know, as what we alluded to earlier, racism is both symbolic and physical, right? So there's many ways to teach about it. And I would rely on curriculum and books that are already created along age appropriate levels and explore that text. We as an organization, if you reach out to us, like we have book lists that we recommend by grade level based off our own experiences and research. And there are other lists out there. I'll also say that all of the lists are not created equally, and you still have to do I don't care if a book does appear on a recommended reading list, you still have to kind of do your own due diligence and check behind it, because times change, and then everyone's perspective is different on what's appropriate and what's not for kids.
Absolutely. And as we come to a close today, thank you, Rhonda. The way you answered that last question is, that'll may take another hour. So I took that as you may have to run it back a little later on in our season. But I really appreciate your insight and your clear communication. I learned a lot. I learn a lot every time I talk to you, and I'm sure that's the same for folks in the audience. I'd like to remind the folks in the audience that our next event in our Justice series will cover the topic of community wellness with support from local leaders. We're going to talk about some of the community-focused systems and solutions that nonprofits put into place during the height of COVID-19 pandemic, what we learned from that experience, and what we want to take with us into the future as we daydream about a stronger, more resilient community. Devin will drop the link to that event in the chat. But you could also check it out on our website, www.unitedwaytriangle.org/event. So appreciate everybody coming. Everybody have a great day. And please join us for our next event. See y'all.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.